overcome by your presence, Lord. Your presence,
Good evening. Good evening. There you go. Hi. Welcome. We are looking at God as judge this month, which I think for me, when I first hear that phrase, gives me kind of this jolt and this shock. I'm like, ugh, it's a very like cringe-worthy kind of title. But I have faith that we do not have to cringe when we think about God as judge. So we'll be looking at that tonight. This is our communion week, as you see before you. This means this is also the week of our month where we focus on what it means to be a family together, be a community together, and our act of communing with one another. So glad you're here for this. Awesome. This is obviously not the kind of God that we worship. So this looks like one of those, fun cartoons from like the 90s that you would find on those where you have one a day and you peel it off in somebody's office. You know what I'm talking about? This is what it reminds me of. But so especially as I'm thinking about the songs that we were singing tonight, we're singing about pursuing God. We're singing about falling on our knees in front of this God. We're singing about a God whose arms are wide open to us. Yeah. This is not the kind of God that we are worshiping. Right. And it's a big deal. It's a really big deal. Right. So the good thing, the good thing is that I don't think that we have to do really, really hard, deep work to deconstruct the way that we feel about God. Maybe for some of us we do, because of different traditions we've grown up in, or different ways that we've experienced God in the past, or been told who God is in the past. But even just thinking about the way that we were worshiping tonight through music, I don't get the feeling that we believe this God is actually real. I don't get the feeling that we in our hearts believe that this is the kind of God that we're worshiping. So the good news is that we don't have to spend a lot of our energy deconstructing this God. We get to spend our energy on figuring out what God is actually like as a judge. So I think that's a good thing. I want to skip this really quick. I would like to ask if I could have 4 people willing to read one verse each. So this is our rooting verse for the month, Micah 4, 1 through 4. If I could have someone just speak out, read a verse, and then pass it along.
And it will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and the people will stream to it.
Many nations will come and say, "Come, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, and to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us about his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For from Zion will go forth the law, even the word of the Lord from Jerusalem."
And he will judge between many peoples and render decisions for mighty distant nations. Then they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they train for war.
Each of them will sit under his vine and under his fig tree, with no one to make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken.
Thank you, guys. Let's go back here. This is something, this was a quote from an article that Kim Braxton posted online this week on our Facebook page. I really, really resonated with this, so I'm going to read it. This is Sarah Bessey, who's an author and a theologian. She says, God wants us to be truly human, the way Jesus walked for and with us. Even the wrath of God isn't something to fear, but something to welcome. Yeah. That wrath is coming against the very things in us that bring death and destruction.
That's good.
Really cool.
That's good.
This, may I remind you, this is not our God, right? We don't even have to worry about this ridiculous, like on the corner of somebody's desks in an office building God.
Right.
That's not it.
Right.
This is our God.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was not here last week. I want to recap just a little bit though what I heard happened. So I know that we talked about freedom not coming from America, freedom not coming from a nation that we find ourselves in, freedom not coming from any kind of socially constructed thing, but from God himself, right? Freedom does not come from the Declaration of Independence, even though we celebrate that last week, but freedom comes from God himself. I know you talked about God not being a judge that renders judgments where one person wins and one person loses. That's the kind of judge that we often think about, is a judge who is able to make a decision that lifts up one party and the other party usually just gets kind of squashed in the process. And we talked about God being the holy, righteous, just judge. I want to make sure, though, if there's something else that stood out from you from last week, if you would want to share that out, that would be wonderful. Something that stuck out, an idea that you think we need to carry forward with us this week.
I wasn't here last week, but I had a dream this week. I've been meaning to call you, Phil. In this dream, the Holy Spirit said, tell the congregation that I declare Ezekiel 9 over them. So I wake up in the morning, I go to Ezekiel 9, and this is just amazing that this is what you're talking about. In this, he talks about this dealing of God with the nations, but there was a people that he marked and set apart from the dealings. And that God just, basically in that dream he just said, I want y'all to know that you're marked for righteousness.
Wow.
And the dealings, he's going to correct things that are going on, but you're not going to be dealt with in the same manner. His goodness is going to be on you.
Wow. Hallelujah.
Read Ezekiel 9 if you get a chance. It's an amazing chapter.
There's something that stood out you need to carry forward with us? So as we look at Micah, I want to give you a little bit of background as to who Micah is, what's going on in his context. This was a fun picture that I found. On his scroll is Micah 6:8, which we will look at later, but that's kind of, I guess that would be Micah's like tweetable passage. So as we're looking at Micah is written to the split kingdom. So at this point, Israel in the north and Judah in the south, they are not one community, they're not one nation, they're split into two, and both of them are just really not doing great things in terms of relating to God well. They are not being loyal, they are not being obedient, they are not being the kind of Israelites that they are expected to be, basically. So Micah is writing that basically because of their disloyalty, they're going to suffer consequences in the future. He's writing to warn them about where the behavior is leading them. But Micah also tells the people that in this future, restoration is coming, and reminding them that even in their disloyalty, God is still in the business of restoring. God is still in the business of redemption and restoration, even as a judge, even when Israel is turned away from him, split into two kingdoms, finding their own people to hold up as judges and hold up as authorities and hold up as rulers, and forgetting about God as this ultimate ruler. So amongst all of that, God is still in the business of restoration. That's going to be a theme for today. But Micah writes to remind them, you are going, on this wrong path. However, God is still in the business of restoration. So when we look at Micah 4:3, this phrase, and he will judge between many peoples. I love Hebrew, so you get some Hebrew nerd stuff today. The word judge in that verb form is shafat. However, it comes from this root word, which is mishpat. Can you say that, please? Mishpat?
Mishpat.
Good job. I was going to explain the vowel mark. The vowel markings are cool. You can also, if you're an Old Testament scholar, you could also read that without the vowel markings, which means you're just reading the consonants, which is awesome if you really know Hebrew well. I don't, so I need the vowel markings. But it's very cool. So this word was what?
Mishpat.
Good job. There you go. So shafat Mishpat, connected also, they are both connected to this idea of judge and judgment and justice, as well as this whole realm of interpretive possibilities, this whole realm of different definitions that are connected to the word mishpat, or judgment. So the cool thing is here, just like that God with the computer, with the piano falling at that guy, we don't have to think about God in terms of this one way that we understand who a judge is, or one way we understand even wrath. So when we look at this word mishpat, this shows up in the Old Testament over like 200 times in all its different forms, all its different cases. So you can see most of the time, I would say it's translated as justice, often translated as judged, judging, judgment. Oh, I'm sorry, the blue goes second. So justice, and then second, rule, rules, ruling, which is connected to also the law in the Old Testament. And the green, judge, judging, judgment. And then all those other kind of smaller cases. And then you can see there's even more. No light, that's okay. So there's even more in there that we don't even know about. Other translations, other interpretations that don't even really show up on this infographic. But all that is to say, judge has a larger group of connotations than we might think it does. We are in the American judicial system. We have a very specific image of a judge. Let me just ask really quick, when I say the word judge and you think about in our context, what do you see in your mind? Judge Judy, I heard that. That's what I think of too. A hammer?
I think it's just someone that makes the decision between who's going to be right and who's going to be wrong.
Okay. Yeah.
I think about the final say. Yeah. That's when it's over.
Yeah. I think about the bailiff and what a weird job they must have. They get to listen to everything and then just intervene when it gets to be, too much chaos. Fun job, maybe. So this is what we're looking at today. The big idea that we're looking at today is retribution versus restoration. And this is not necessarily something that you will find explicitly in the Bible. This is not a biblical concept. However, I would argue that this is a really helpful way for us to figure out what kind of judge God is in terms of looking at our own current legal system and the way that we understand judge and juries and the judicial system now to help us understand better what kind of judge God is. So you're not going to be seeing a lot of scriptural references here. You're going to be seeing more cultural references, but I think it's going to help us understand this God better. So basically what we're looking at here is a difference between justice as punishment or justice as revenge versus justice as restoring and justice as healing.
That's
and
good.
I bet you can guess which one God is.
That's good.
I bet you can.
That's good.
So retributive justice. This is the justice that we know. We know the lady, she's blind, she holds the scales. It's a very mathematical way of thinking about what's right and what's wrong. One is obviously heavier or lighter than the other, and so the scales of justice are tipped whatever way, whatever way the outcome is, the scales of justice are tipped to make sure that somebody is punished correctly for the crime that they've committed. Obviously, that leads into how we logistically do punishment, which in our society, especially in our nation, is incarceration. So that's kind of the go-to, I would say, that's the end point of where this system leads us, is punishment, incarceration, and other even more violent means as well. I want to talk a little bit about the point in my life when I could not trust the human justice system anymore. So this is Trayvon Martin, several years ago. It just seemed to me to be this overwhelming feeling that there is so much wrong going on here. And this is so big that whatever the outcome of the trial for George Zimmerman was, we weren't going to actually get justice. There was no way that something could actually be made right in the situation. And so I it was very controversial. This is something I think that I think people will remember this moment in history too, as it's really started to kind of flavor the last few years of our society as well. The last few years of kind of what America is paying attention to and the questions that we're asking. And so for me, this moment reminds me of the questions that I started asking. I grew up with, I think, a decent sense of trust in the human justice system. A decent sense of trust that, like, yeah, somebody will figure out what's right and what's wrong, and they will enact it. And then with Trayvon, it was like, man, this is just not cutting it. There's a difference between our human justice system and God's justice system. There's something that's missing. So for me, that was the moment that really started getting me more interested in God's justice system, getting me more interested in figuring out how we pursue justice in our small communities, in our relationships with one another, when a lot of times it seems like we're not going to find justice from human-created justice systems. This is Brad Jersak, an author, theologian that Eric introduced me to. He says, retributive justice, which is the punishment, is the lowest form of justice and unjustly projected onto the God who is the perfection of justice, defined as making things right. He made things right on the cross through mercy and forgiveness instead of vengeance and violence. When God says, let justice roll like a mighty river, he's not saying, let wrath or punishment roll, but rather, the establishment, maintenance, and when necessary, restoration of a just society in which all are welcome to the banqueting table.
That's good.
I like what he says on the second line, God is a perfection of justice, making things right. I'm going to propose today that God is not interested in making things equal so much as he is making things right. I'm proposing that God is not interested in punishment as much as he is interested in making things whole and right and good and restored. All are welcome at the banqueting table. Whether you did something wrong, whether you had wrong done against you, whether you were the one whose house was broken into, whether you are the one who was breaking into the house, you are welcome at the banqueting table. That is not the God with the piano on the dude's head. Right. Not at all. This is a very different kind of God that we're looking at. So this Hebrew word again is shalom, down there in the blue. I'm going to ask anyone who would like to just to read out the different interpretations or words that help us get the fuller picture of what shalom means.
Reconciliation, peace, welfare, health, safety, well-being, prosperity, wholeness, and security.
Isn't that good? Aren't those all great things?
Yeah.
I think especially as a Western culture, we tend to think of peace as just when we're not in wartime. So peace is just when there's an absence of conflict. Peace is just when things are like fine and whatever. Right. When I'm not in chaos, when I'm not in conflict. But shalom, God's vision of peace and God's vision of the kingdom is all these things all at once. Reconciliation is active, where individuals and communities are reconciled to one another in friendship. Health is active. You're not healthy if you just assume that nothing's wrong with you. Health is a flourishing thing. Prosperity is active. Wholeness is active. Security is active. So shalom is the big picture of what God is looking at. This is the big picture of what God is working towards. This is the end result of justice, hopefully.
Yeah.
When God does his just work, when God judges, he is not making sure that somebody's punished. He's making sure that there is shalom.
Yeah.
So very, very different realities.
Good.
So here's another way to look at it. This is a human-created system. This is something that's being enacted all the way from individual classrooms up to national levels, especially in New Zealand. This is their national way of doing justice in their judicial system. So I'm not proposing that restorative justice is the way that the kingdom works, but I'm giving us a human, I'm giving us a familiar metaphor maybe, or a human system to help us understand a little bit clearer what the kingdom is like. I'm not going to assume I know exactly what the kingdom's like, but I think this reminds me of it.
Yeah.
So restorative justice, like Brad Jerzak mentioned, has to do with making things right. That's kind of the tagline for restorative justice. It involves the victim and offender and community. Usually in our justice system, whoop, my gosh. Okay. Usually you have two parties. You have someone who did something wrong, someone who needs to punish them. We have two parties here. In restorative justice, we have three parties. So the victim who was hurt, the offender who did whatever hurting happened, and the community. So it's a much more holistic way of looking, how do we actually solve this problem? How do we solve this conflict? There are multiple parties involved instead of just that dualistic mathematical two scale or that scale situation. I really like the picture up in the top. This came from an education magazine, and it has to do with communicating to one another. Community means that you're going to have to talk to people. Restorative justice does not just happen in courtrooms. It does not happen with just a judge and a jury. Restorative justice usually happens more in relationships, whether it's an individual talking with someone, whether it's a group of support and accountability for the offender to make sure that they are healthy, to make sure that they don't reoffend, to make sure that they are actually getting what they need to live a healthy, shalom-filled life. So this image of the people kind of around the circle and the roots growing out is a great image for restorative justice. I want to share a little bit about my experience with restorative justice. I've heard it called justice that promotes healing, which is a great way to think about it as well. My experience has been in my classroom at school. If you know Teresa Leonard, she is a master of restorative justice in her own small classroom with her third graders. And that means that her third graders, they do hurt each other. They do offend each other. And then they know exactly how to restore their relationships. They know the scripts. They know exactly how to figure out how they restore these relationships and get back to wholeness that was once there. I'm sure you guys have even seen that. So this happens at a very small level with third graders in a classroom, learning how to talk to one another and learning how to really to appreciate and respect one another even though they hurt each other. This happens on a larger level in terms of groups. There's a group called COSA, which stands for Circles of Support and Accountability. I was part of for several years. And these are offenders that have been released from prison and need people. They need community. They have said, we really don't want to reoffend. We don't want also to just be lonely in this world and not have a community to actually support us. And so it's a structured program where you have small groups of people who support one another. I have a friend who I was in a program with, who I was in a circle with, and now 5 years later, he is married and has a baby and has a healthy life and has just, I mean, I don't know, it's hard to explain, but he, I think the way that he sees himself and the way that he sees the world around him is completely different than it was several years ago, mostly because he had relationships that were supporting him. On a national level, this can be, restorative justice is used in New Zealand as the main form of their national justice system, their national judicial system, which says we don't necessarily want to just mete out punishment when punishment is due, but instead, what was the conflict, what happened, what are the details of how people are unhealthy, how do we need them to be healthier, and we're going to make it happen. This is beautiful, beautiful stuff, and especially in classrooms around the States, restorative justice or restorative discipline is becoming more popular. And I would venture to say that it is a more kingdom way of doing justice. It's a more kingdom way of people relating to one another. So it's not the kingdom, not at all, definitely not. This is not God's justice, this is not biblical justice or kingdom justice, but I think it looks a lot like it, and it's really exciting to see it growing. If you look at the difference between the questions that the justice system asks. I think this is a really helpful way to think about the difference. So the criminal justice system asks, what law was broken, and who broke it, and how do we punish them? Pretty simple, cut and dry, very mathematical. In restorative justice, practitioners ask what harm was done and to who, because that question wasn't even asked in the first one. So the victim has more of a voice, which is huge. So what harm was done and to whom? What needs have arisen based on that harm for anybody? Victim, offender, community. And third, whose obligation is it to meet those needs? Victim, offender, community, somebody else? I don't think I need to go into all this right now, but I have this resource for you if you're interested. I'll let you look at it for a minute, but a really clear difference in terms of setting up an education system that's based on zero tolerance or punitive retributive justice versus restorative justice. It changes a kid's whole day. It can change a kid's whole life. It changes a kid's whole perspective on how they even view themselves, how they view their role in the community. This is big stuff, especially for little ones, I think. So it gets me really excited because it looks like the kingdom and we can do it with our little ones. Really, really exciting.
Yeah.
Another just chart that helps understand, that helps kind of just describe what the focus of restorative justice is. So at least the model that I learned, at the very bottom, everyone has to have a commitment to be constructive. You're going to have to recognize that we are not enemies in the situation. Or if we are enemies, I'm going to have to commit to be constructive, which is hard. However, if we are kingdom people, I think that's got to be one of our first commitments.
Yeah.
So this has to do with caring and valuing and love, forgiveness, and mutual recognition that injustices are recognized. So the problem is not swept under the rug. The conflict is not ignored. It is named. It is said. Second, that equity is restored to the situation. And third, that future intentions are clear. And I'm kind of nerding out right now because I really like this model. But remember, we're talking about God as judge, right? So just remember, it all connects. All right. Can I ask who recognizes this? Okay. I'm going to read. I'm going to read History.com's account of this event. And to give you some background, I was 7 years old, and most of the students from my school were picked up and they went home. And some of the students in my school said that they felt it. They felt the shake. On April 19, 1995, a truck bomb explosion outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, left 168 people dead and hundreds more injured. The blast was set off by anti-government militant Timothy McVeigh, who in 2001 was executed for his crimes. His co-conspirator Terry Nichols received life in prison. Until September 11, the Oklahoma City bombing was the worst terrorist attack to take place on U.S. soil. On June 2, 1997, McVeigh was convicted on all 11 counts against him, and on August 14, the death penalty was formally imposed. In December 1997, Nichols was found guilty on 1 count of conspiracy, 8 counts of involuntary manslaughter for killing federal law enforcement personnel, and was sentenced to life in prison. In 2004, he was tried on state charges in Oklahoma and convicted of 161 counts of first-degree murder. He received 161 consecutive life terms in prison. I'm going to read that again. 161 consecutive life terms in prison. In December 2000, McVeigh asked a federal judge to stop all appeals of his conviction and set a date for his execution. The request was granted, and on June 11, 2001, McVeigh, who was 33, died by lethal injection at the U.S. Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. He was the first federal prisoner to be put to death since 1963. So Terry Nichols, the co-conspirator for Timothy McVeigh, received 161 consecutive life terms in prison. Mathematically, it makes sense. For every life that was taken, he received a life term. But that's crazy. Mathematically, it makes sense, but it doesn't make sense at the same time. So here's the question. Did Timothy McVeigh's death bring any of those people back? Did his execution change the culture of Oklahoma City? Our human justice system did not bring about actual justice. It brought about more death to compensate for death. It brought more death to pay back for death. So our friends in the Calaveras house who were broken into, is it justice to find the thief and steal his stuff? Call it even? Is that going to restore anything? Is that any kind of justice? Does that make anything right? Have you been wronged or harmed? Probably. If the offender was punished, did it really restore anything? Did you feel content? Did you feel whole? Did you feel shalom filled? And so the question is, what kind of justice are we actually looking for? Are we looking for justice that's born out of revenge and born out of a desire for punishment and born out of a desire for this mathematical equality? Or is it born from a desire for real shalom? What's more important, that people are punished or that things are made right? This is Sister Helen Pujan, who has spent much of her life fighting against the death penalty because of that exact reason. She believes that justice is not achieved when we pay back death for death, or when we pay back life for life, or when we try to mathematically compensate what was lost. She says every human being is worth more than the worst thing they've done. All life has dignity, guilty life too. And she reminds me more of God's justice. Her vision for wholeness and her vision for shalom reminds me of the kingdom. So when we look at the cross, the very death of God at the hands of humanity was not enough to keep God from wanting to restore our relationship and make things right. God on the cross did not say, well, mathematically, I've got to punish you. Well, mathematically, we've got to compensate for this. Not enough. Even that, not enough to keep God from wanting to restore our relationship and make things right. God has always been turned toward us, as we've looked at for the last 6 months. He's been turned toward us and facing his love toward us as Trinity, as Creator, as Pursuer, as Liberator, as Teacher, as Patient Father, and even as Judge. He's toward us. He is faced toward us. And so, I'm suggesting we are called to live toward our neighbors as well as our enemies. If we are ambassadors of God's restorative justice, I think that's our only option. The swords are being turned into plowshares. We are not studying war. We are not getting ready to defeat our enemies. We are getting ready to turn towards and love our enemies with a restorative justice that makes no mathematical sense. It really doesn't. So there's an idea that our love of God is best tested by the way that we love our neighbor. That actually shows how we love God. And our love of neighbor is actually tested by how we love our enemy. So our love of enemy, maybe your worst enemy, maybe the person you do not want to be faced towards at all, maybe the people group or the system that you don't want to be faced towards at all, how you love that enemy actually shows how you love your neighbor, and how you love your neighbor actually shows how you love God. And so I think we are called to love with the restorative, healing, shalom-filled justice that God loves us with. Looking at Micah 6:8 later in the passage, or later in the book, Micah moves from condemning Israel, telling them what they're doing wrong, to encouraging Israel and what they should be doing right. So Micah says, this is what Yahweh asks of you. Only this. Just these things. Oh. To act justly, to love tenderly, and to walk humbly with your God. Just those, Micah says. Those are the big ones. Act justly, love tenderly, or other translations say love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. And it's in response to the way that God treats us, and the way that God judges us in love, and the way that God acts in justice toward us. So I included this last picture. This is a statue at the United Nations. And this is a man beating a sword into a plowshare. It's really interesting to me because I don't know of any nation that would actually want to do that, though. I think we know this is what God is calling us to. I think we know that this is what God's kingdom actually looks like. But I don't know anybody on a national scale who's actually doing this. I don't know a commander-in-chief who's going to say, you know what, you're right. Let's take all those guns and make them into farming implements and give them to Jeremy. I don't know about that. But I think to see this at the United Nations in front of this international organization, I think it says something. I think it says we know what actually is good for us, but we're locked into this mathematical way of trying to compensate and trying to make things even and trying to punish. So the good news is that is not the God that we serve. And the good news is if we are people of faith and we are people of hope, we actually can get closer to this ideal than the United Nations can. It's a good thing.
That's good.
Yeah, let's pray.
God, we thank you for
who you are in love toward us. We thank you for who you are in wrath and judgment toward us, that you are always for us. We thank you that your justice is one that we maybe don't even understand fully. And we thank you that you give us community to figure it out. We pray you would remind us that the way that we love our neighbors reflects how we love you, and the way that we love our enemies reflects how we love those neighbors. God, we pray that you would just deepen in us a desire for your justice, to figure out what that looks like on a small scale with our spouse, with our friend, with our neighbor, and on a large scale with the systems that bring chaos into our lives. God, we pray that you would show us your shalom over and over and over again in small glimpses if need be, and let us understand that with clarity, let us understand that with coherence, let us see more and more what your kingdom looks like and what your justice looks like and who you are as our judge.
We're going to be having different people every month be officiating or handing out the communion to the community, and so today Destiny is going to be officiating communion for us all. So let's give her a hand.
The table of bread is now to be made ready. It is the table of company with Jesus and all who love him. It is the table of standing with poor of the world, with whom Jesus identified himself. It is the table of communion with the in which Christ became incarnate. So come to this table, you who have much faith, and you who would like to have more, you who have been here often, and you who have not been for a long time, and you who have tried to follow Jesus, and you who have failed and have failed. Come because it is the Christ who invites you. It is his will, that those who want him should meet him here.